In the 1970s, a Romanian scholar made a fascinating discovery while researching the Mongolian Empire, a confession dated to the middle of the 13th century. This confession was anonymous. The witness who heard it and consequently wrote it down in a letter to his archbishop did not indicate any name or any belonging to family or clan. This confession simply belongs to an Englishman that was captured from a retreating Mongolian army. The content of this confession is like no other. Having been exiled from England for some unspecified political crime, the Englishman found himself in the Holy Land during the Fifth Crusade. There too something occurred which led to him being recruited by Genghis Khan's spies as a translator. He thus worked his way up the Mongolian ladder to become an envoy of the empire itself, something that only a handful of other Europeans ever managed to achieve. His confession places him in the courts of Hungary some 2 decades after his recruitment. He was presenting the European people with a simple choice on behalf of the Mongolian Empire: submission or death. A few years later, his life ends in an Austrian prison as a war criminal and eternal traitor to Christendom. Naturally, the scholar was faced with rather difficult questions. Who was this Englishman? How could a Christian Englishman find himself on the other side of the world, representing those that his own people called the brood of the Antichrist? And the most important question of all, how reliably can we retrace his journey in order to find our answers? A small handful of scholars consequently tackled this question with varying results. The most conservative outlook was that except the story he provides in his own confession, there is nothing of note that we can learn about the Englishman. The most liberal approach, on the other hand, spins entire fictions out of this episode, allowing total creative freedom under the guise of academic research. This approach leaps from one conclusion to another based on nothing but a hunch, to the point of concrete identification with one specific historical figure. The aim of this video is thus to condense these approaches to some sensible middle path, to allow ourselves some freedom in drawing conclusions without inventing entirely new histories for all kingdoms involved. In order to do this, I have chosen to outline the historical setting and gently work in some certainty and guesswork amid this historical setting. The Englishman will be worked in piece by piece as we progress through the fascinating tapestry of 13th century Europe and Asia, from King John and the Magna Carta to the elderly Genghis Khan and his grandson's campaign against Europe. On this laid out tapestry, we can perhaps then find some worn out, faded needlework from the Englishman himself. This is the mystery of the Mongolian Englishman. It is only natural that we begin our investigation into the mysterious Englishman from his own fatherland, England. According to his confession, he spent the first 3 decades of his life there. The Englishman was exiled at some point before the age of 30. Again, according to his confession, he was exiled for a political reason. At first glance, this is all very vague, but the fact that his exile was political in nature allows us to connect the dots with the political happenings of the time, and thus we must set the scene in 13th century England. The year is 1212. John Lackland is king, and we immediately find ourselves in an interconnected mess. The infamous King John, so thoroughly hated by his contemporaries, was at this time cornered by 3 opponents: the Catholic Church, the French, and his very own nobles. King John's feud with the Catholic Church began over the appointment of an Archbishop of Canterbury, a certain Stephen Langton. His appointment was spearheaded by the Pope himself, Innocent III. Langton made a great name for himself as a theological scholar in the University of Paris, where Pope Innocent had also spent his youth. To this day, a shared academic heritage is enough to secure most favorable positions. This appointment not only ignored the candidate that the Canterbury monks had put forward, but also another candidate that King John had tried to force upon the church. Generally speaking, the position and aim of the Catholic Church at the time was the promotion of its authority over local rulers, at least in ecclesiastical matters. Kings all over Europe were strengthening their royal authority, and in order for Christendom to continue thriving with a spiritual supremacy, the Church had to dabble in politics as well. Of course, this dabbling was a great issue for King John. He personally distrusted the papally appointed Stephen Langton, precisely due to the fact that he had spent a significant amount of time in Paris, i.e. with the opponents of England, the French. King John's refusal to accept Langton as the new archbishop led to an interdict, a Christian lockdown, so to speak. From 1208 onwards, Christian practices were put on hold. Public worship was suspended, i.e. there was no mass for the people of England to go to. Marriages couldn't be blessed, nor could the dead be properly consecrated. I believe it would be redundant to express just how much distress such a state of affairs would cause the people of England during such a profoundly Christian time. It goes without saying that during a spiritual suspension, the local clergy is rendered mostly useless. There is also no incentive for them to stay in the country, really. Why not sail over to France or some other place nearby and try continuing your career over there instead, at least until the interdict blows over? In fact, this becomes a much more favorable option when your ruler is a despot. After all, despotism and military incompetence are the two things that King John is most remembered for, however right or wrong that may be as a historical approach. King John considered it a great idea to profit off of this interdict. Those who stayed behind and abided by the orders of the church to suspend all practice were personally punished by King John. He seized their property and taxed them however he could, and the only way to stop this was to break the rules of the interdict. Thus those priests that stayed in England found themselves between a rock and a hard place, as they say. Those who left in search of a new place of practice were also punished. Since they weren't around anymore to inhabit their properties, King John couldn't see a reason not to seize them as well. Obviously, this is an attack on the church. Instead of seeking a quick end to this interdict, King John simply doubled down against the church through financial extraction. This attitude led to his excommunication. Thus, a deeply Christian people found themselves outside of Christian service, with an excommunicated king who didn't really seem to care. Now, the reason for his aggressive financial extraction against the church is not mere greed, although it certainly played a part. Here we are led to his second opponent, the French. King John's father, Henry II, ruled over quite vast lands in France, part of the so-called Angevin Empire that he himself established. Under his possession was a bit more than half of modern-day France. As is the case very often indeed in historical tales, his son entirely fumbled it. Philip II of France outclassed him on all fronts, and King John had lost the beautiful lands of Normandy at the start of the 13th century, and not only Normandy. Naturally, an animal whose pride is wounded and whose territory is impeded upon will froth at the mouth to get it all back, but fighting back requires funding. In a feudal system, much like a mafia, there is a chain of kickbacks. The lowest classes provide their yields to their masters. These masters then provide a cut up the chain, and this eventually arrives at the king. The king, in turn, has his fingers on the dial. If he needs more money, the dial is turned up, and the message is passed back down through the chain. I need more, thus you will give me more, from the king all the way down to the peasant. In theory, if a king is feeling extra generous, or as a countermeasure to rising discontent, he can also turn the dial down and demand less. Thus the entire chain is more or less entirely dependent on its final authoritative link. As we just said, getting French lands back under English control required funding, and so the dial had been turned up quite a bit indeed throughout the years of this conflict. As history shows us time and time again, it is the nobility that feels its monetary losses the most, and it is the nobility who is most ready to act against financial despotism. A brief period of higher demands is alright, if it serves a good cause, but King John was humiliated at every turn. Thus this financial extraction from both the church and his nobility was seen as rather pointless. In light of his military failures, many a chronicler began to wonder whether King John is actually using any of the money that he's extracting. Could it be that he was instead simply lining his pockets at the cost of England itself? Keeping in mind that King John had been excommunicated and was still actively defying the will of the church, Pope Innocent worked up a marvelous plan. He pledged his support for a French invasion of England. This was a win-win situation for the church and for France. If successful, the church would get an obedient Catholic onto the English throne, while France could reverse the Angevin Empire and paint the English map with its own colors. On top of this, however, the mere threat alone was beneficial for the church. If everything went according to plan, King John would finally submit out of fear, begging the Pope to withdraw his French support for this invasion. Thus, these two separate opponents merged into one. As we just mentioned, the nobility also presented another issue for King John. His recent failures fanned the rebellious spirit. Money was being taken and seemingly thrown away. Of course, not every noble respected the authority of the church. Many were quite happy to support King John in his stance against the Pope's increasing nosiness. But it also became evident rather quickly that King John did not have what it takes to resist the Pope in an appropriate manner. It goes without saying that the few nobles who spoke up about this publicly were very quickly dealt with, and so this class of individuals was once again relegated to the shadows, and plots began to form. Thus, by the year 1212, King John was in an extremely complex and tangled political mess. Backed into a rather terrifying corner, he took the easy yet still painful way out. He submitted to the Pope. Stephen Langton was put into the position of Archbishop, but this was not enough to repay the damages and shame that King John had brought upon the church for several years. What was deemed enough was for John to submit the entirety of England as a fiefdom to the Pope. To keep it simple, King John turned himself into a vassal. This statement is a bit of an exaggeration, since the only real consequence here was that John had to pay a hefty tribute to his new master, the Pope. But symbolically, his punishment was heavy and very humiliating. With this extra humiliation under his belt, vast swathes of national money thrown into the wind, and further military defeats as all of this was happening, the nobility could not keep quiet anymore, and their plans revealed themselves from the shadows. A certain figure appears here around this time that we really must mention. This is Robert Fitzwalter, a feudal baron from Essex. He was one of the leaders of this unhappy nobility. Alongside a group of many other nobles, he confronted King John and demanded reform. Specifically, Robert and the wider armed nobility demanded that King John confirm the Charter of Liberties. This was a document from some 100 years ago that put down as law how the nobility and the church should be treated by the King of England. Very favorably, of course. Its original drafter was Henry I. Evidently, King John had no interest for this charter up until this point. None of its rules and suggestions were being followed. He had simply been ignoring it. This had to change. Robert Fitzwalter mounted an army and gave himself a new title, Marshal of the Army of God and the Holy Church. This army then marched on London, successfully occupying a space for themselves. From this space they denounced the king and awaited his response. Obviously, a king without his nobility is worth very little, and so King John had to play their game. Under the suggestion of Pope Innocent, who was very unhappy that in his recently gained fiefdom seeds of civil war were being sown, King John met the rebelling nobility with the Archbishop, Stephen Langton. Langton was the one who would negotiate a peace deal, a document setting down laws for the future relationship between king, nobility, and kingdom. This document eventually came to be known as the monumental Magna Carta. The most remarkable clause within this document is the creation of a Baron Council, the so-called Security Clause, number 61. The nobility would now elect a council of 25 barons that would hold the king accountable vis-à-vis the Magna Carta. This is rather unheard of for a medieval monarchy. Perhaps we could call this a proto-judiciary branch, and the Magna Carta a proto-constitution. This document was agreed upon by all parties and confirmed with the royal seal, but this is unfortunately as far as it went. King John for some reason did not commit to upholding this agreement. Nothing within the country really changed. There was no perceptible air of freedom for the nobility to breathe on the next cool morning. All they really got was a verbal and written yes. Robert Fitzwalter, being very aware of this, did not stand down. King John saying yes was simply not enough after everything that he had put them through. And so began the First Barons' War of 1215, a full-fledged civil war. In order to not lose track of our primary goal here, the mysterious Englishman, we will keep this civil war very brief. In a desperate move to gain massive military support against King John, the nobility invited their French counterpart into the conflict. Specifically, this was an invitation for Prince Louis, the son of Philip II, to take the English throne. This is how poorly the nobility thought of King John. They were willing to cede the kingdom to France. Prince Louis was to promise to uphold the Magna Carta, thus benefiting all of the royal subjects, and hence in 1216 French forces also landed in England, to whom many barons immediately swore their allegiance. By modern standards, this was nothing short of pure treason. As is the case with countless conflicts, both domestic and foreign, everything came to an end with an unexpected death. King John died from some mystery illness that very same year, in 1216, at the age of 37. He was succeeded by his 9-year-old son, Henry III, to whom many a disloyal baron returned immediately. A new young king marking the end of a despot is always cause for celebration. It is a promise of potential relief. The great William Marshal, an outstanding military man who had been advising the throne for several decades by this point, now acted as regent for the 9-year-old king, and William Marshal immediately undertook the effort of reconciling the torn kingdom. The Magna Carta was revised to make it more sensible for all participants. In one swoop, this calmed the rebelling nobility with the promise of a new and reasonable young king, and it also severely weakened the efforts of Prince Louis. He now lost a major English contingent for his efforts of taking the English throne. As an act of sensible policy, William Marshal then handed out punishment. Civil wars cannot be started without any consequence. We cannot motivate such behavior every time our people are unhappy. The leading figures of the rebellion were temporarily exiled, alongside the disobedient clergy that supported the barons, although many more were in fact simply forgiven, with a financial slap on the wrist in most cases. Robert Fitzwalter was one of the individuals that faced temporary exile. There is a handful of reasons why we refer to this exile as temporary. Primarily, with the right amount of money, exile could be reversed. A heartfelt gift is always appreciated as an apology, as long as it is given quietly, later, out of the public eye. The second reason, specific to this time, was the Fifth Crusade, which was conveniently mounting at this precise moment. Pope Innocent had at this point also passed away, like King John, and so the English crown sought to reunite on favorable terms with the new pope, starting off fresh, with fresh players on each side of the political authority game. The opportunity for the crusade was perfect here. The crown exiles the leading members of the warring nobility. The Pope supports this decision, with the caveat that they can redeem themselves by pledging their bodies and finances to the crusading cause. Thus, England publicly punishes its rebels, knowing that they will return with gifts, and those who have no gifts to give or do not want to make these gifts can redeem themselves and go back home after serving the needs of the great Catholic Church in the crusading effort. It is from this point that the Englishman really begins to concern us. According to his confession, he was exiled for an unspecified yet serious political crime. Having considered his age and environment, we can make our first identifying statement here. The Englishman most likely participated in the Civil War on the side of the barons, and he was exiled as punishment once William Marshal and the young king came to power. His path to redemption thus lay between two avenues. Either he makes a very generous gift, or he achieves spiritual redemption in the upcoming crusade. In either case, he could then return to England. Of course, he did not return to England. Instead, some 20 years later, he returned to Europe as an envoy of the Mongolian Empire, bringing a message of submission or destruction. Naturally, this eliminates him ever having made a gift, i.e. he probably did not have enough wealth to buy himself out of exile. Considering that the exile also touched the retinues of the barons, their chaplains and such, it is then perhaps safe to say that the Englishman was one of these individuals, part of the crew of some specific baron. A very small but significant episode, a memory in fact, will make this much more probable later in our story. Following the disastrous Fourth Crusade of some 15 years prior, which culminated in the sacking of Constantinople and the permanent weakening of the Byzantine Empire, yet another crusade was mounted in 1217. It was the brainchild of Pope Innocent III, and when he passed away, this mantle was passed on to his successor. The goal of the crusade was the same as always, to reclaim Jerusalem and the remaining Holy Land from its Muslim rulers. This crusade got off to a very strong start. The crusaders set their eyes on Egypt, the heart of Muslim power in the region, the Ayyubid Sultanate. Weakening the Sultanate's grip would result in a weakening of the entire Holy Land, and thus Jerusalem could be reclaimed. A perfect plan on paper, but paper doesn't always suffice. An entire video of its own can be made on the intricate details of this crusade, but what truly concerns us here are the first 2 years, where, according to the confession, the Englishman was present. For reasons that will be made clear shortly, it will benefit us to follow the trail of Robert Fitzwalter as a major participant in these crucial years of the crusade. Wishing to redeem himself in the eyes of the new powers of England and the new Pope, Robert Fitzwalter sailed for the city of Acre, arriving in September of 1219 with an array of other barons involved in the civil war, as well as his noble retinue, of course. While he made this journey, the siege of Damietta was already well underway. This was an Egyptian port city at the mouth of the Nile, a very strategic location. A great attack could be mounted upon Jerusalem in a pincer formation from Acre and Damietta. Upon Fitzwalter's arrival in Acre, the meeting point of the Crusaders, he was immediately rerouted to Damietta to assist in the war effort. There, the other Crusaders were happily accepting all the late stragglers. Robert Fitzwalter was a bit late to the crusade due to having been locked away in a prison cell after the Civil War. Thus he set sail again, and was at Damietta shortly thereafter, with his contingent. It is in Damietta that one of the most important details for identifying the Englishman arises. You see, when the Englishman was captured in Austria 23 years later, he was also recognized. The person that recognized him was Prince Frederick II, the future Duke of Austria. His father was a participant of the Fifth Crusade on behalf of Austria, and apparently brought his 8-year-old son with him to Damietta. The witness of the Englishman's confession included in his report that the Duke of Austria knew this Englishman from a very long time ago. He recognized him immediately as the man who was expelled from England. Considering the future long path that the Englishman must have trodden in order to end up at the Mongol court, there is practically no other common geolocation for them to have made an acquaintance except Damietta. Considering that the young Frederick was a royal child, he would have had no exposure to the irrelevant lower classes present at the siege. Thus, if they did truly meet there, the Englishman must have arrived in significant company. For example, the company of Robert Fitzwalter. This is all quite confusing at this current moment, but everything will make sense as we go on. While some individuals take this moment as a certain historical fact that the Englishman was present in Damietta and the future Duke of Austria met him there 20 years before seeing him again in Austria as an enemy now, I will say quite the opposite, using a great Russian proverb. This is written on water by pitchforks, i.e. this is all entirely uncertain. Relying on the memory of a young boy is in itself a recipe for disaster, but realistically speaking, we do have two facts here at play. In 1242, the Duke of Austria personally recognized the Englishman upon his capture. The Englishman himself, in his confession, admits to having participated in the Fifth Crusade all those years prior. Nothing beyond this can really be ascertained, despite the efforts of several creative researchers. For the purposes of fun, however, we will allow our imaginations to be humored at this stage. Thus, the Englishman, seeking redemption for his crimes in England, participates in the crucial siege of Damietta, where, on account of him keeping very noble company, he is noticed by a young future ruler of Austria. Another crucial detail is found here within the confession. Shortly following the successful siege, the Englishman is yet again banished. According to him, he was caught gambling, and as his punishment he was kicked out of the crusading effort, leaving him without a chance for any kind of redemption. To be banished twice is an achievement, we must say. If we believe the Englishman's words, i.e. that he was indeed banished for gambling and not for stepping on people's toes, then another interesting hypothesis can be made here. You see, the assumption that every crusader was perfect and pure is very naive. There are several records of general debauchery occurring in both Acre and Damietta. Pillaging, nighttime fun, gambling. One chronicler compares the general atmosphere to another very famous city of sin, Paris. And yet getting banished from this environment was not too common, especially not for gambling. What else do soldiers really have to do in their spare time? A hand of poker or two won't bring Christianity down to its knees. It is perfectly normal. So how did the Englishman then manage to get banished from the crusade? Here we must touch a little bit upon the Knights Templar. Any enthusiast of Christian military history will of course be intimately familiar with the spiritual powerhouse, their white mantles with bright blood-colored crosses. This was monastic discipline with an extremely hierarchical militia, the blending of military prowess with notions of spiritual purity. This is pure beauty and personally the height of Christian achievement for me. But fawning aside, for those not too familiar with the Knights Templar, let us set the basics in order, and then see why they are mentioned at all in the hypothetical story of our Englishman. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, or the Knights Templar for short, was a military order, a militia of the Catholic Church. Its roots were in the First Crusade. After its great success, many Christian pilgrims could now visit the multitude of sites across the Holy Land. Jerusalem itself was very secure, but obviously the rest of the Holy Land not so much. Thus the idea of creating a security force for these pilgrims came to the great European minds. It started out as a small project with a small handful of knights, 9 of them to be specific, but it grew incredibly quickly into a pan-European phenomenon. A severe amount of verbal support and physical finances were poured into this militia, to the point where they were able to establish branches in several European nations. The Knights Templar quickly moved on from their basic security function and became an arm of the Crusaders. At the order's peak, it counted approximately 20,000 initiated members. There is a lot of legend in regards to how these initiations looked, what kind of esoteric Christianity they were practicing, mostly debunked accusations of heresy and so on. The point here is that much like the modern French Foreign Legion, this militia was the place to be for ferocious young men seeking to start anew. This international organized structure followed an extremely rigid hierarchy. At the top of the chain you had the Grand Master, an elected position that was held for life. Beneath the Grand Master you had noble knights. As the name implies, this was reserved for the aristocratically born. It is also these knights and these knights only that participated in the election of their Grand Masters. These noble knights received the best equipment. They were dressed as heavy cavalry, the famous white mantle, with an outside higher squire and several horses. Beneath the noble knights you had the sergeants. This is the non-noble layer. Anybody could join as long as they were debt-free, not in service of another lord or order, unmarried, and in good health. The sergeants predominantly wore brown instead of white, still bearing the red cross however, and they also received military equipment, though much less of it, only 1 horse for example. For all intents and purposes this was the light cavalry. The final class beneath the sergeants were the chaplains. These were men trained in Christian religious practice in order to serve the spiritual needs of the classes above them. All of these men were united in the fact that they had shed their previous lives and were born anew, as new warriors in the name of Christ and Christendom. It is important here for our theorizing on the Englishman to look at the code of conduct for the Templars. As we have just mentioned, every individual that joined the order had to fulfill a list of requirements, mainly health, not having any debt, not having a wife, and not belonging to another order or lord. Having met these requirements, each member would be initiated in a secret ceremony where he allegedly had to beg to be let in. He was then warned about the difficulty of the path he is about to undertake, and then there was a pledging of vows of obedience, chastity, and poverty. The initiate would then receive his equipment, transfer over any and all possessions to the order itself, and begin his Templar life under a strict rule of conduct. This rule of conduct was made explicit in the so-called Rule of the Temple, much like the rules that govern the life of regular Christian monks or the members of a Buddhist Sangha. Every aspect of their daily life was codified. The Rule of the Temple grew to over 600 articles toward the later years of the order. In order to not get bogged down in the details, we can imagine this rule to be similar to that guiding Spartan life. Mix this in with typical rules and vows that a Christian monk would take, and we end up with a Spartan-like warrior monk community of laconic speech, utmost allegiance and loyalty to one's brothers, total ignorance of wealth and lust, and so on. To ensure that the warrior monk was abiding by the rule, there would be annual meetings for every single branch, where Templars would confess their sins and receive their rightful punishment. This ranged from periods of enforced fasting to beatings and ultimately expulsion. Those who were known to violate the rule and not come forward to confess voluntarily would usually face the most severe punishment, i.e. they would get kicked out. A warrior monk must have selfless initiative in cleansing himself of any prideful, wrong act. Considering this code of conduct, we can perhaps now present a rather interesting theory. Our mysterious Englishman may have belonged to the Templar Order. This is the only group present in Damietta at that time which would have dealt so harshly with a gambler. Again, I must repeat that the average crusader present in the Holy Land at the time was no saint. It would take far more than some hands of blackjack to be banished from the crusading effort, unless you were a Templar. Assuming that the future Duke of Austria did indeed place the Englishman correctly in his memory, and that the rebels of the English Civil War were exiled in the year 1217, this leaves approximately a year and a half entirely unaccounted for in the life of the Englishman. One possibility, of course, is that he simply went to Acre with the very first wave of Crusaders, and then he hung around until the arrival of Robert Fitzwalter, with whom he then met the future Duke of Austria in Damietta. Another possibility, however, as much as it may be reaching, is that the Englishman spent that year and a half renouncing his old identity, his previous crimes. He joined the Knights Templar in some European chapter, and he then found his old partners in crime, the barons, in Damietta. These barons kept very good company with the Duke of Austria, and thus the young Frederick. This is a somewhat complicated amalgamation of events, and I myself cannot help but see some faults in it. But for the purposes of identifying the activity of our Englishman, no better attempt has yet been made to cast him in concrete company at a concrete time and place. Setting our theorizing aside and turning back to our primary document, which is the Englishman's confession, we have one truth in our hands. Having been banished from the crusade as a gambler, the Englishman was left with nothing to his name. Whatever ties he had to his previous life were now cut. Unless he came into a large fortune quickly, there was no buying his way back into the English lands, and thus the Englishman was left to wander. It is at this time that we must also note the only thing he really ever had to his name, even when stripped of all possessions, the one thing that would save his life for the next 2 decades, a discovered talent for languages. The predicament that our Englishman found himself in upon his second banishment was truly a trying one. In theory, exile is quite common to stories of great adventure. This applies to the Englishman as well. But this does not mean that such circumstances are easy when it comes to practice. The reality is that people exiled in this way are forced to survive, like animals, wandering in searches of refuge for the night, work for the day, and perhaps a warm meal as the greatest reward. Luckily for the exiles of the time, there still remained certain avenues, granted that the exiled shows great strength of character to seize them. One of these possibilities was to defect to the enemies of the crusade. Being a man of letters, as witnesses to his confession so stressed, our Englishman could have joined the Muslim side as an interpreter for diplomatic purposes. Many a crusader chose this option as a way out of capture, or having themselves made too many bad decisions within crusader circles. Here we speak of much more serious crimes like murder, theft, and so on, not just gambling. For some reason, the Englishman did not choose to pursue this path. Instead, for several years, he simply carried on walking east, in a shameful state of want and in an enfeebled state of body. This is his own words. He was taken in by various Muslim places of refuge, and as he himself says, this kindness was appreciated, although in his heart he wished for nothing more than for the devil to finally take him and end his life of wandering toil. Somewhere in southern Iraq, the Englishman decided he could wander no more. Thus he settled down and, being a man of letters, began to study the local tongue as a way to occupy his time and perhaps blend in with the locals. He wanted to finally feel some semblance of having a home. Evidently, this came to the Englishman very easily. He copied down the sounds of words he heard being spoken around him. He practiced their pronunciation, figured out the meanings of these sounds, and within some undefined time, he spoke as well as a local. Not only did he learn the language of the locals, meaning Arabic, but it is likely that he also picked up some of the Turkic dialects spoken by the local mercenaries. No doubt, having been a crusader, even if it was brief, he would have made great company with other soldiers in the region. It is here where the Englishman began attempting to build a new settled life that he was noticed by the Mongolian spies of the great Genghis Khan. By the time that our Englishman was approached by Mongolian intelligence forces, somewhere around 1223, Genghis Khan was an elderly man. A majority of his great conquests had been achieved, his immense legacy cemented for the eternal future. His empire stretched from the China Sea to the southern Caucasus, with all eyes set on the subjugation of Europe. As much as I would like to spend several hours addressing every facet of the Mongolian Empire up until this point, a separate video is warranted. Let us stick only to the most necessary. By this point in our story, Genghis Khan's empire had already cemented itself as the largest ever empire on the Eurasian landmass. This largest ever empire was also less than a generation old. Its creation was the product of unrelenting military genius, light years ahead of any European capabilities, combined with great political, diplomatic ability. It goes without saying that all of this was neatly tied up and brought together by a great, controlled potential for explosive violence. Of course, at its heart stood the great Temujin, better known to our day as Genghis Khan. Modern scholarship suggests that translating this simply as Great Khan or even Great Ruler should suffice for popular use. Temujin was born sometime around 1162 into a profoundly nomadic culture of tribal life. The greatest concern of each tribe was to secure pasture for their grazing animals, defend these animals as they produced their food and tradable goods, and then move on to new pastures once the soil had been depleted. Naturally, such a life came with fierce competition, constant absorption of smaller tribes by larger tribes, which was then followed by fractures, breakaway tribes forming from within families, and this cycle kept repeating. The climate of the boundless steppe kept these tribes on their toes as well, with its harsh winds and occasional droughts. As a countermeasure to these dry periods, both trade and border raids had to be integrated into the life of tribal strife. China made for a good neighbor as an occasional victim or partner. In this difficult environment, Temujin persevered. By this point, I am sure that everybody is familiar with the story of Temujin losing his father, having to face life in the steppe with a greedy older brother, Temujin killing this brother at a ripe and young age, then being kidnapped and put into captivity, and so on. Through this pressure, his steel was hardened, and his unstoppable will eventually placed him at the top of countless Mongolian tribes, whom he had unified. Thus, around the age of 44, Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan by his shamans and subservient Mongol chiefs, and the subjugation of empires followed. I wish to say once again how much it personally pains me to condense this phenomenal rise to power into a single paragraph. Please let me know in the comments if you would like me to dedicate a full video to this subject. From the beautiful, isolated steppe of Mongolia in the late 12th century, Genghis Khan's forces had penetrated all the way through to Eastern Europe's front porch by the time that our Englishman found himself banished from the Fifth Crusade. In order to understand why they chose to recruit him in southern Iraq, we must mention a key element to the success of Genghis Khan's assaults: espionage. It has long been cemented in the mind of the average individual that the Mongolians achieved success through brute force, and in very plain words, savagery. One pictures a horde of horse-backed, tattered, frothing at the mouth berserkers, a wall of bodies crashing into the battlefield, tearing down fortifications and slaughtering their way through every household, bathing in blood. Of course, we will not downplay the brutality of the Mongolian soldiers. It is indeed true that many a million fell to brutal assaults, and subjugation was sometimes achieved through the most vicious means. The greater the resistance, the worse the consequences. However, as a lot of modern scholarship will now attest, this is not the full picture, and behind every explosion of battlefield brutality was a carefully calculated campaign, whose success hinged almost entirely on the quality of its reconnaissance. The intelligence networks that the Mongolians had set up as they ventured further and further west were truly remarkable for their time. There are several records of Eastern European and Central Asian men of letters showing concern at just how infiltrated their side of the world was with Mongolian spies. Trade routes were of utmost importance, specifically the outposts where traders would rest and recuperate before continuing their journey. It is in these outposts that a significant amount of information would be concentrated about foreign lands, their strengths and weaknesses, the failings of their kings, and so on. Much information can be extracted over a friendly drink by the hearth. In combination with total intelligence domination of important trade routes, the Mongolians also had many a gift to give to locals for their information. A man who is unhappy with his lands, or a criminal on the run, has a lot of valuable intelligence to provide, especially if he is cornered and showered with gifts. In fact, this is precisely how the Englishman found himself with the Mongolians. According to his confession, he was approached by Mongolian spies on account of him being visibly European and yet being able to speak Arabic fluently. This talent for languages was noticed, and thus gifts were showered upon the Englishman. The very same Englishman who had just spent several long years traveling through dry, boiling climate, looking for refuge so far away from his home, in very poor health and of very poor spirit, with close to nothing to his name. Any man in dire straits would find such a bribe difficult to resist. Thus, our twice banished Englishman found himself finally employed. He was finally valued. His linguistic talents were recognized, and having been pleasantly embraced by a significant growing power, his life could begin anew. It is at this point that the Englishman disappears for approximately 15 years. Whether his confession did not survive in full, or the person who wrote it simply did not care for the pettier details of his upcoming years, cannot be ascertained. Within the document, this silent period is instead dedicated to detailing every aspect of Mongolian life, from how they carry themselves within their units to their world view, their proficiency with the bow, and so on. All of this came from the mouth of the Englishman. The level of detail given by him makes it quite probable that he traveled into the depths of the Mongolian Empire in order to get better control of the language, to pledge his allegiance and also be properly informed on his upcoming work as a translator. In any case, our Englishman goes entirely silent from 1223 until 1237, whereupon he arrives as an envoy to Hungary on behalf of the Mongolian Empire, demanding subjugation or destruction. Keeping in mind the somewhat plausible theory that he traveled to the Mongolian seat of power upon his recruitment, or somewhere near there at least, allows us to investigate two very interesting aspects of the Mongolian Empire. That is, what their development of an embassy looked like, and the power that an interpreter would have enjoyed once he proved his talent and was successfully absorbed into the freshly established administrative structure. In short, where and how would the Englishman have worked within the Mongolian machine? Genghis Khan's seat of power, Karakorum, the heart of an immense empire, was nothing more than a conglomeration of tents. But considering the size of his lands, it was still utterly devoid of any formal institutions that allow for the effective governing of these lands. It was precisely during the time when the Englishman could have potentially arrived at Karakorum to be sworn into service that Karakorum would undergo a remarkable transformation on behalf of Genghis Khan's Chancellery. In fact, if the Englishman did truly arrive at Karakorum at such a foundational, formative period, then it is no surprise that he would rise through the ranks and become a primary envoy for the future European campaign. He was one of the first original members of the administration's revolutionized bureaucracy structure, if we allow ourselves quite a bit of hyperbole. The effort to transform Genghis Khan's wandering seat of power into an actual capital was undertaken by a certain Yelu Chutsai. His nickname was Longbeard, on account of his impressive 6'8" stature and a beard that reached down to his waist. A decade or so prior, in the 1210s, Longbeard served as a counselor to the Jin Empire, the Jin dynasty that ruled the Chinese lands to the south of the Mongolians for approximately 100 years. These were the same Chinese that the Mongolians at the time of Genghis Khan's youth would have raided for supplies during poor climate seasons. This dynasty was guilty of sponsoring tribes hostile to those of the Mongolians, and thus it was a great thorn in the side of Genghis Khan. This was an enemy that he had on his mind for decades as a target for elimination. In the year 1211, Genghis Khan invaded the Jin Empire and successfully fought against them on numerous occasions, until their full capitulation to the Mongolians in 1234. It was during one of these numerous early victories that the imperial advisor Longbeard was captured. It is said that Longbeard stood out to Genghis Khan for the first time due to his occupation. On the list of captives, he was listed as an astrologer and soothsayer. Interestingly enough, Longbeard did not belong to the Jin dynasty. He served them in full capacity, as his father and grandfather before him, but he was in fact of Liao origin. This was the dynasty that ruled prior to the Jin and was eliminated by the Jin. In the eyes of Genghis Khan, Longbeard was serving his dynasty's historical opponents, his subjugators. He was a glorified slave. Legend claims that Genghis Khan brought this up directly to Longbeard when he came to inspect the captives. Quote, "The houses of Liao and Jin have always been enemies. With my victory against them, I have avenged you." In return, Longbeard displayed a great amount of courage, or perhaps stupidity, by verbally counterattacking Genghis Khan. He said, "My father, grandfather, and I myself were the servants of the house of Jin. I should be a liar and a hypocrite if I were to pretend now that I have hostile feelings towards my father and our emperor." This response struck a very positive chord with Genghis Khan. It was so different to the usual slave-like responses that he would hear from those that he captured. Usually, they would appeal to Genghis Khan and his greatness. They would badmouth their entire kingdom and lineage if it meant only that Genghis Khan would be appeased and let them live. For his honesty and courage in the face of the great Khan, Longbeard was granted the post of court astrologer. He was to read the astrological signs and work his magic, so to speak, in order to help the Mongolian court. In this post, he showed great competency and rather quickly grew in power, becoming yet again an advisor and eventually a very trusted friend of the great Khan. This friendship saved the lives of countless individuals. On many occasions, Longbeard spoke up to prevent needless slaughter of recently subjugated peoples. In his own words, "Why kill a goose if it can later lay 1,000 golden eggs?" Permanent institutions were needed to rule and cope with the vast conquered territories of the Mongolian Empire. Courts needed to be established for the dispensation of justice. Financial experts had to be brought in and given proper structures to work in order to oversee the collection of taxes. A general political unit had to be established in order to create social cohesion between the plethora of tribes and kingdoms that now found themselves under Mongolian rule. As Longbeard himself once said to Genghis Khan, "Empires won from the saddle cannot be ruled from the saddle." Of course, it was much easier for Longbeard to supervise the building of houses and buildings for merchants than to convince the high-ranking Mongolian warriors to settle down into ordinary imperial life. For a people that had spent their whole lives on horseback, fixed residential places were only suitable for the dead, and even the dead themselves, in the case of Mongolian tradition, traveled with their people for eternity. The tent, the yurt, could be pitched anywhere, and it could be packed up just as easily when needed. But a house was permanent. A house impeded upon the possibility of always being flexible for war. In this respect, once again, Genghis Khan was revolutionary and innovative. He was willing to oversee this change. He was willing to force Mongolian life to shift for the purposes of imperial rule. He was more flexible in this regard than most of his court. Longbeard was responsible for assigning individuals to all the important posts in the new administration. A majority of the appointments went to educated Chinese, doubtlessly in an effort to save the lives of his compatriots, but an occasional post was up for the taking by any man of talent. Our Englishman, as an interpreter, surely fit into this structure. Longbeard organized the administration on tried and tested Confucian principles: social harmony between all the moving parts, a strict adherence to hierarchy, i.e. knowing your place, and of course a great emphasis on merit. This is something that Genghis Khan himself had a personal liking for as a practice. By using the cultural and organizational framework of China to create this newly ordered state, the empire was thus able to survive the forthcoming death of its divine ruler. Genghis Khan died in August of 1227. The spirit of Genghis was codified along Confucian principles, synchronized with the physical demands and ways of the Mongolians, which helped the empire progress, if only for a short time. Its fragmentation was coming shortly, and it happened for the most typical historical reasons. There were too many sons fighting for the succession. It goes without saying that Longbeard was not the only individual of note for the consolidation of this new superstructure, but for our intents and purposes, he is by far the most significant. It was Longbeard that instituted physical paper money in sweeping monetary reforms. It was Longbeard who introduced a family-based tax system instead of the relatively arbitrary extortion that the Mongolian generals had practiced up until that point. Outposts of the Mongolian communication network along trade routes were turned into serious local branches of the administration. Everybody now required travel permits in order to pass through any of these outposts, and all of the information passing through them would very quickly make its way back to the bureaucrats of Karakorum by way of letters. These letters were to be translated, interpreted, summarized, and presented to higher officials. Once again, we must imagine the Englishman as part of this structure. The most important change that Longbeard implemented, at least in my opinion, was the Mandarin testing system for civil office. Every single individual within the long reach of the Mongolian administration now had a chance to be tested. If his results were promising, this opened up a great path for a bureaucratic career. This meritocratic testing approach ensured that the exceptional do not fall through the cracks, based on the fact that they were unlucky to be born in the wrong place at the wrong time or in the wrong family. The Mongolians coming to subjugate you did not spell certain death or even certain slavery, not anymore. The testing system provided for one final way out, granted that you had the intelligence for a bureaucratic position. Of course, none of this was perfect from the get-go, but it was indeed the correct step forward. It was what the empire needed if it was to efficiently rule over its glorious acquisitions. Genghis Khan passed away in 1227. Shortly before his somewhat mysterious death, he let his top officials know of his intentions for the future of the empire. More specifically, how the empire was to be separated for the purposes of succession between his sons. The two descendants that concern us here are his son Ogedei and his grandson Batu. The heart of the empire, East Mongolia, went to Ogedei, on account of his favorable temperament and general ability. The northwestern lands of the empire were left to the grandson Batu. Into his possession also fell any future western land that the Mongolians would manage to capture, as far as the hooves of a Mongol pony can take him. Seeing that the responsibility to attack Europe fell on Batu, we can safely assume that the Englishman's service was also included in this will. His talent for languages was key for the Mongolian conquest approach. For the foreseeable future, i.e. another decade of silence on behalf of the Englishman, he probably served in bureaucratic capacity as Batu prepared to go west. Ogedei, the new Khan, was no Genghis Khan. He liked his father's ferocity, his disdain for lavish living, and was not as emblazoned by the idea of making war. Do not get me wrong, Ogedei proved himself shortly after his ascension to the throne, but a fundamental difference of character was certainly present, such is the case with many sons of great conquerors. According to legend, Ogedei Khan was also a heavy drinker. Longbeard, who remained in his post as significant advisor and administrator, allegedly once put a piece of iron in a glass of alcohol. This was meant to show how corrosive drinking can be, but Ogedei Khan was not convinced. Regardless, thanks to Longbeard and a set of rules that Genghis Khan verbally polished throughout his life, the empire survived the passing of its mythical creator. The torch was passed on successfully. The army was in phenomenal shape. Intelligence networks continued to bloom as outposts grew, and thus an order of priorities could be mapped out for the foreseeable future. The first and foremost concern was delivering the long-needed fatal strike to the Jin Empire. As we mentioned in our segment on Longbeard, Genghis Khan oversaw several victories against the Jin, but its full capitulation was not yet achieved. Once the south of the empire was under control, their attention could be turned to fully pacifying Western Asia. The third and most grand undertaking would then be the conquest of Europe. This is what the spirit of Genghis demanded. Shortly after being sworn into his divine throne, Ogedei Khan oversaw the successful destruction of the Jin Empire. If it was up to Ogedei, he would have slaughtered the entire population. It was once again Longbeard who spoke up for his ex-countrymen, reminding the new Khan of his eternal wisdom. There is more benefit to be gained from effective subjugation rather than extermination. Another Mongolian army rode to Asia Minor and Persia, completing the conquest of Western Asia. The third and most challenging enterprise was now Europe. By the 1230s and 1240s, Europe had received many a rumor of the devastation of its eastern neighbors. The Mongolian approach was much misunderstood and mischaracterized. More and more, the common consensus grew from pure ignorance of the looming fact to a belief that these were nothing more than eastern savages, as some chronicles state, of no faith and of no diplomatic ability. Both of these labels are wrong, especially the latter. On its surface, Mongolian diplomacy was very primitive. An envoy arrives and demands subjugation. If subjugation is not granted, doom is foretold. The envoy then leaves. A study of the available documentation, however, reveals something rather more advanced. Letters were created with a royal seal, where a world view and message were laid out much more coherently than a simple threat of destruction. There was a formula to each dispatch, a letter always opened with an elaboration of the Khan's eternal power, the power of the eternal heavens, of God, who demanded that the Khan bring the masses under his divine mission. From the perspective of the Mongolians, their conquest of the world was perfectly justified, in a moral and legal sense. It was the manifestation of godly power, of the eternal blue sky. Genghis Khan famously once said that he was put on the earth by the divine in order to punish many sins. Since Genghis Khan's empire was not merely a state, but an earthly reflection of God's rule in heaven, any king who refused the order for submission was defying the will of God, a rebellious sinner. The Englishman in his own confession states that the Mongolians thought there was nothing wrong in practicing cruelty against those who rebel from the heavenly mandate. I believe there is no better encapsulation of this view than a letter to the Catholic Pope penned by Ogedei Khan shortly before his death, after the Mongols' decisive victory in Hungary. Quote, "These people ignored God's order of submission, so much so that they even held a great council, behaved very arrogantly in their rejection, and killed our ambassadors. So the eternal God himself killed and eliminated the people of these lands. How could anyone on his own, without God's will and assistance, ever manage to kill and plunder those lands in such a manner?" The Mongolians made it to Central Europe in 1241, but this was not their first time in Europe. In 1223, the Mongolians briefly entered Eastern Europe and won a very famous battle for Russian history at the Kalka River, one of the many interesting moments of what was history's longest ever cavalry raid. The Mongolians covered 9,000 kilometers over 3 years, without pause. For a variety of reasons, the Mongolians then went east after this, and did not return until 1237, under Batu Khan's leadership. The rest of Kievan Rus was shortly razed and subjugated. It is in 1237 that our Englishman finally appears once again. According to his confession, which was corroborated and confirmed by several contemporaries with knowledge of events, it was the Englishman who led the envoys to King Bela, the king of Hungary. Our Englishman, having gone silent for 15 years, finally resurfaced, and it was he, a man who once fought against English despotism and then sought religious purification in the Holy Land, who now brought a message of looming destruction to his Christian world. If not for the confession document itself, our assumption that the English envoy in the court of Hungary was the very same Englishman from 2 decades ago would have been utterly ridiculous. He was not the only person capable of learning languages, and not the only European in the employ of the Mongolian Empire. A position of personal envoy and an ambassador translator, of course, was quite rare indeed for a non-Mongolian or non-Turkic individual. But 15 years of total silence is also extremely suspicious. What makes all of this even more questionable is that our Englishman suddenly commanded the Hungarian tongue. Where would he have learned to do this? His command of various Eastern languages is certainly much more believable, but where did a talent for Hungarian spawn from? Nevertheless, the confession makes it clear, and in fact stresses this fact. Upon the Englishman's capture in 1242, he was instantly recognized as that specific Hungarian envoy, as well as the Englishman of 24 years prior, who was present at the Fifth Crusade. Despite the painful lack of other documentation on our Englishman, it appears he did have some semblance of a reputation at that time. By 1237, the Hungarians were very well aware of the Mongolian threat. They stood as a gateway to the rest of Europe, and thus, in our modern world at least, it would be entirely expected that they be fortified with the entire strength of Europe behind them. The Hungarians were geographically close to the Russian lands that fell during the Mongolians' brief stint of 1223, and so they learned rather early, by 1229, of Mongolian military potential. They were informed of this by fleeing refugees. Thus, in theory, Hungary had close to a decade to prepare itself, to mount a great military, to train its nobles and their eldest sons in the art of war, and of course to seek support from the rest of Europe. Some support was granted, but far too little. Europe was far too busy with its own politics, with its own factions and fragmentation. They did not seriously weigh the importance of a fortified Hungary, i.e. a fortified front door. Moreover, nomadic invasions had not been seen for quite some time. They were a thing of the past. And by this point, the average European simply did not think of the eastern savages as more than some larger than average tribe. They shouldn't pose a problem for some couple thousand great European knights. A large mass of light cavalry, however, will outdo a small unit of heavy cavalry. History will prove this in just a moment. Speaking of light cavalry, Hungary effectively didn't have any. As we just mentioned earlier, nomadic invasions were a thing of the past, and the skill and training required to maintain extensive light cavalry forces were simply not worth the effort. Europe had slowed down in its manner of waging war, and thus the military focus was on slow, heavy warfare. One could say that Europe matured past the light, quick age, at least for this time period. However, light and quick warfare was now being imposed upon it once again by the Mongolians. In an effort to bolster his forces, King Bela of Hungary invited the nomadic Cumans to settle in Hungary. In theory, this would have been a great boost to the defense force, but the newly settled nomads found it very difficult to get along with the local peasant population. Lands that were worked and cultivated for decades were now used as feeding grounds for Cuman horses. There was a tangible clash of culture between the two populations. We must remember that being nomads, the Cumans had a fitting shamanistic religion, while the Hungarian peasants followed the Catholic faith. Rather quickly, rumors began to circulate among the Hungarians that the Cumans were just another insidious arm of the approaching Mongolians. It didn't take much for a group of men to try and do something about this perceived saboteur. Thus, the Cuman king was killed in his camp, and the Cumans immediately fled south, razing the country as they traveled through it. Thus, Hungary was left to stand alone against the looming invasion. This Mongolian invasion was further sealed by the fact that Hungary welcomed the Cumans in the first place. A prior engagement between Batu Khan and the Cumans meant that these Cumans were now marked as rebels. Of course, we saw earlier what is to be done to those who rebel and those who house these rebels. There is an interesting theory worth mentioning here. The rumor that caused the Hungarian peasantry to rebel against the Cumans, that the Cumans were in a secret alliance with the Mongolians, could have itself been spread by the Mongolians as a way to incite chaos prior to their invasion. There is no confirmation of this theory, but the Mongolians did utilize this tactic once before, during their conquest of Central Asia. It is possible that the prior success of this tactic had warranted using it once again. Passing through the year 1237, when the Englishman visited the Hungarian court and was kicked out, we arrive at the fateful year of 1241. Alarm bells had finally begun ringing throughout the Christian world. The incredible extent of destruction that Eastern Europe had seen, mainly the fall of majestic Kiev, finally garnered the attention of significant faces. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II voiced his great concern and attempted to rally the English king to action against the coming Mongolians. Pope Gregory in fact announced a new crusade against the eastern threat, but Europe simply did not have any attention to spare. The main fight of the continent for that time period was in fact between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope, for a variety of reasons that I would like to cover one day in a separate video on the Great Frederick. The point here is this: much like a body focused on fighting a major disease, it paid no attention to the paper cut. But it is precisely in a diseased body that an ignored paper cut can devolve into a vile, gaping wound. Nevertheless, by the early spring of 1241, an impressive defense force was raised to guard the front door of Central Europe. Approximately 150,000 men were successfully mobilized, although estimates do vary. Let us not forget the unhistorical approach to numbers that the human race preferred up until very recently. The estimations of Batu Khan's forces vary wildly, anywhere from 15 to 600,000 cavalry. Relatively recent Russian studies of the Mongolian incursion into Eastern Europe number all of the Mongolians present in the region of 600,000. But this includes a vast amount of non-military individuals, messengers and bureaucrats and so on. The European campaign was commanded by one Subotai, who easily deserves a spot in the pantheon of the best generals in human history. Subotai saw many successes from China to Central Asia under Genghis Khan's leadership, and was now subservient to his grandson, Batu Khan. It is in Subotai that we find true Mongolian obedience on the battlefield, a discipline mixed with terror and personal motivation. This allowed him to smoothly issue all sorts of strategic orders, knowing that the men under his command will abide, even if they do not see the sense behind a certain move. An extremely mobile and obedient army, combined with vast intelligence gathered all throughout Eastern and Central Europe, ensured Subotai's unyielding success. The large Mongolian military mass was split into three. One army was sent north to attack Poland and proceed south toward Hungary, while another army went south into Moldavia. This was a pincer movement. It squeezed Hungary from top and bottom, while Batu Khan and Subotai himself faced Hungary head-on from the east. Despite King Bela's somewhat decent mobilization, he was not ready for this squeeze. Batu Khan and Subotai charged into the heart of Hungary and reached the Dunaj River. The confrontation between Hungary and the Mongolians was about to occur, but then the Mongolians retreated on the advice of Subotai. This retreat was not for any reasons of fear or incompetency. It was a military tactic to see the reaction of the Hungarians, and then choose the right approach for the ensuing attack. If the Hungarians did not follow them and stood their ground at the Dunaj, perhaps the squeeze from north and south would have to be accelerated. But if the Hungarians followed them, as they ultimately did, they could draw the force further and further away from their central fortifications, and thus get a better chance to both defeat them and then chase them down as the stragglers flee. Thus, the Mongolians drew them to the town of Mohi, where, at a much heavier cost than normal, the Mongolians defeated the Hungarians. This battle was perhaps the most important event in all of Hungarian history. What followed was a siege of the capital by Christmas of 1241. This was a history-changing blow to the Hungarian kingdom. The capital was lost. Towns and villages were razed. Families were taken as slaves. Their daughters were taken for other purposes. And their eldest sons were, of course, killed. Amid all of this, the West remained mostly quiet. King Bela, who had fled, received nothing more than small donations from the church and some letters of condolences. The Holy Roman Emperor sent some forces into western Hungary to begin assembling his own defenses for the westward-facing Mongolians. Hungary was therefore occupied on the right by the Mongolians and on the left by the Germans. King Bela, who was invited to Austria to seek refuge, got arrested immediately upon his entry into the country by Duke Frederick, the very same duke who is about to recognize our Englishman. The reason for King Bela's arrest was some kind of old debt, and he was only released after he pledged his remaining finances and 3 counties to Austria. So much for European unity. A Bavarian chronicler wrote in that fateful year an epitaph for the bulwark of Christendom. In this year, 1241, the kingdom of Hungary that had lasted for 350 years was destroyed by the Mongolian people. The destruction of Hungary, of course, meant opportunity for new conquest. Local resources were sucked up by the Mongolian horde, forces were replenished, new slaves were acquired, and of course there was a great boost of confidence by this decisive victory. The slate was wiped clean and the same tactics were prepared to be used again, this time against Austria. As usual, small raids and incursions were launched in order to instill terror and to gauge the future battlefield conditions. The bulk of the Mongolian army continued to settle down and revitalize themselves in Hungary, while small scout armies were directed to Austria. Austria, however, was different under the leadership of Duke Frederick. They got a chance to see how exactly their neighbors were destroyed and thus prepared themselves a lot better. The Mongolian raids were not as successful as they had been prior. In fact, Duke Frederick even managed to annihilate an entire Mongolian squadron. This small success, however, did not spell guaranteed victory for when the main bulk of Mongolians would get back on their horses and enter Austria. Here, only fate could save Europe, and it is now when fate would indeed play her most favorable hand. As the Mongolians prepared to enter Austria, infuriated by the Austrian obliteration of their scout units, a certain piece of news altered history forever. Batu Khan's uncle, the Khan Ogedei, had died. These news took quite a few months to arrive in the westernmost part of the Mongolian Empire. Ogedei Khan passed in December of 1241. It was now March of 1242. Batu Khan now stood before a choice of severe consequence: to continue his conquest and subjugate Europe, which for the time being seemed inevitable, or to return home and compete for the recently empty throne. He could not afford to be away from Karakorum while the Council of Chiefs and Sons determined the fate of its succession. Furthermore, while Genghis Khan was still alive 2 decades prior, he had demanded that all members of his clan be present for every council, especially those that would deal with succession matters. Batu Khan therefore faced both obligation and personal ambition. This is the leading theory for why the Mongolians pulled out of Europe on the brink of their massive European war. Another theory states that the Mongolians saw the geography of Europe as extremely unfavorable and ultimately not worth their effort. Mountains and dense forests were difficult to navigate in such vast horseback numbers. There is no reason either to choose between one theory or another. A combination of both could be true. Batu Khan, understanding the necessity of coming home lest he disobey tradition and be overlooked for power, also saw a need to retreat and rethink his approach. We must also keep in mind that although their victories in Hungary were decisive, they were also heavy. As much as we may have underplayed European military capabilities, they were still a very tough nut to crack. Indeed, recent archaeological evidence confirms just how much more than usual the Mongolians suffered during their Hungarian offensive. In any case, the Mongolians pulled out in 1242. This retreat was tactically sound. It wasn't a simple packing up and fleeing. Batu Khan launched numerous diversionary raids to each and every unconquered neighbor, comprised of entire armies sometimes, as his own force retreated. The message here was very clear. We are not done. Even in our retreat, we endlessly probe and test you, for when we return. This return came in the form of Batu Khan's Golden Horde, but Europe, as we now know, would never come as close to the Mongolian threat as it did during the fateful year of 1241. As the chronicler of the Englishman's confession notes, one of these diversionary raids occurred in Lower Austria. The force was smaller than usual, and thus the Austrian Christian forces decided to pursue it. This choice of pursuit allowed for the telling of our story, almost 800 years later. The Christian force somehow caught up with the smaller than usual diversionary raid party and captured 8 of its leaders. Among these 8 leaders, one stood out. He was of fair skin and above average height, perfectly European in appearance, nothing like his Mongolian counterparts. And yet, he communicated with his Mongolian brethren in their own tongue, like a native, born and raised in Mongolian lands. This was, of course, our Englishman. The report of his confession states as follows. The Duke of Austria knew one of the captives to be a native of England, who was perpetually banished from the realm in light of a certain political crime by him committed. Furthermore, this fellow, on the behalf of the most tyrannical king of the Mongolians, had been twice as a messenger and interpreter with the king of Hungary, menacing and plainly foretelling those mischiefs which afterwards happened, unless he would submit himself and his kingdom unto the Mongolian yoke. The languages that he spoke were also here confirmed: Hungarian, Russian, Cuman, German, Arabic, and Mongolian. Among these, without doubt, we must also add English, for it is in the confession that his English origins are so stressed, and it is his English origins which make his employ for the so-called brood of the Antichrist so much more puzzling. Our Englishman's luck had run out in Austria. Just as in a nightmare, his entire past caught up to him. Political turmoil in England some 2 decades prior, gambling in the Holy Land. Every new leaf he turned was now dead and rotten, withering away. For Europe, this capture was of utmost significance. The Englishman was a real key to understanding the ins and outs of the Mongols. A large part of his confession is dedicated to detailing every aspect of their life. Their proficiency with the bow, how exactly their military discipline is handed out, what kind of formations they utilize, and their most favored tactics for the taking of a city. This was a goldmine of information for the Austrians and for the rest of Europe, who, for now, were acting on the assumption that the Mongolians would in fact return for future conquest. The year 1242 marks the end of the Englishman's trail. We do not know what happened to him, but it is safe to assume that he was shortly executed for his crimes. By modern standards, the Englishman was a European war criminal, a great enemy and traitor to Christendom. The record goes silent, and until very recently, the Englishman was entirely forgotten to history. What must have been a busy life of adventure and great turmoil amounted to nothing worth remembering for centuries. This is a most unfortunate fate. As a religious traitor, a Christian who sided with the brood of the Antichrist, he most probably received an unmarked grave following his death. The attempts that have been made to discover who he was and where he lies have been completely unsuccessful. It is thus the end of our journey, and this makes me somewhat emotional. In my study of the Englishman's fate and the environment he functioned in, I grew to respect him. Generally speaking, men of action demand such respect, regardless of crimes committed. If we operate on the assumption that our theorizing about his life and movements were mostly accurate, we end up with a person who lived through a lot. A life that was much more interesting than what was commonly available. Had you been born into medieval times, chances are you would have been a serf or lived in some form of slavery. The Venetian slave trade of the time was truly vast. If you were lucky, you would be born as a noble. Depending on the location of your birth, a life of nobility could also be quite unpleasant. This is all granted that you survived the wars in the first place to see it through to the end. In light of this, the Englishman did indeed enjoy quite an exceptional life, even though it was riddled by misfortune or maybe miscalculation. One thing is painfully obvious here, however. The truly fortunate are able to escape their past. In this way, the Englishman did not meet fortune at all. It is quite symbolic indeed that after years and years of wandering, of building a new life from whatever material was available, our Englishman's life ended with a focus on his earliest days. His identity was tied to King John and the banished nobles, the Crusaders, and underlined by banishment. Even the fact that he was captured as part of a smaller diversionary army was in itself a form of banishment. He did not have the luck to retreat with Batu Khan's main forces back to Mongolia. The very final episode of his life was thus an indirect banishment. The Romanian scholar whose work made this entire story possible went as far as to identify this Englishman. In his educated opinion, the Englishman was a chaplain of Robert Fitzwalter. As you may remember from the start of our story, this was one of the leading barons of the opposition to King John. This chaplain's name was also Robert. Apparently, it was Robert of London, if we were to be specific. I personally find this identification to be a leap, at best. As we have highlighted throughout our story, the Englishman's identity rests on a multitude of assumptions, and these assumptions are made atop other assumptions. Following the publication of his research, our scholar has had a fair amount of critique thrown at his methods and conclusions. He gives far too much certainty to things that we have highlighted as nothing more than creative theorizing. As the saying goes, if the foundations of your house are not solid, the rest of the house will not stand. At the very top of this house, on the beautiful tiled roof, we find this alleged Robert of London, of whom practically no record exists. As much as this identification may be intriguing, and as much as the name of Robert suits an Englishman, we will never know for certain, and the evidence available right now is nowhere near enough to even begin looking for a concrete name. At most, we can draw a path, as we did today. Nevertheless, we do have some facts, and we do have some memories, and the tale that we have laid out of a man exiled from England, banished from the Holy Land, and in long service of the Mongolian threat is good enough. Undoubtedly, even if half of this story is true, it makes for a fascinating life worth remembering. I am honored to have been the one who presents this fascinating life to you.